In the spring of 1945, Winston Churchill sat alone in his private study at 10 Downing Street, composing a letter he would never send. The intended recipient was President Franklin Roosevelt, but Roosevelt had died suddenly on April 12th, and Churchill found himself writing not to communicate, but to organize his own thinking. The subject was American military leadership, specifically the two generals who had come to represent fundamentally different approaches to warfare, Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton. Churchill wrote with unusual candor, knowing the letter would never be read by another living soul. "We have been fortunate," he wrote, "to have in General Eisenhower a supreme commander who understands that alliance warfare is as much political as military. But I confess, I sometimes wonder whether we would not have ended this war 6 months earlier had we possessed a supreme commander with Patton's instinct for the enemy's throat, combined with Eisenhower's gift for managing difficult personalities." Churchill crossed out the last sentence. It was too honest. It revealed what he actually thought about the command structure that had won the war in Europe. He folded the letter, placed it in his personal papers, and never mentioned it publicly again. But that unsent letter captures something essential about Churchill's private assessment of the two most consequential American generals of the Second World War, an assessment strikingly different from anything he ever said in public. This is the story of what Winston Churchill genuinely believed about Eisenhower versus Patton, why his private opinions were so much sharper than his public praise, and what those opinions reveal about how the Allied coalition actually functioned behind the carefully maintained narrative of unity and cooperation. Churchill's understanding of American military leadership did not begin with fixed opinions. It developed gradually, through direct observation, through intelligence reports, through conversations with British commanders who worked alongside Americans, and through his own interactions with Eisenhower and Patton across 3 years of war. Churchill's first significant exposure to Dwight Eisenhower came in June 1942, when Eisenhower arrived in London to take command of American forces in the European theater. Churchill invited him to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, for a weekend designed to let the two men take each other's measure away from the formality of official meetings. That weekend shaped Churchill's initial assessment of Eisenhower in ways that would persist throughout the war. Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, recorded detailed observations of the visit in his diary. Eisenhower arrived on Friday evening, June 19, 1942. Churchill greeted him warmly and immediately launched into a sweeping discussion of global strategy that ran well past midnight. Colville noted that Eisenhower listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the political constraints Churchill faced in managing British public opinion and parliamentary pressure. What impressed Churchill most during that first evening was Eisenhower's explicit recognition that coalition warfare required compromise. When Churchill outlined British concerns about American strategic priorities, Eisenhower did not dismiss them or insist on purely American solutions. He acknowledged that Britain and America faced different vulnerabilities and different domestic pressures that had to be factored into any plan. Churchill told Colville the next morning that Eisenhower was unlike any American general he had previously encountered, But Churchill also noticed something that troubled him during that same weekend. When the conversation shifted to specific operational plans, Eisenhower deferred constantly to his planning staff. He spoke about what his staff were considering rather than what he himself had decided. He described operations in terms of consensus among his subordinate commanders, rather than in terms of his own tactical vision. Churchill, who had served as a combat officer in his youth and held strong opinions about military tactics, found this approach admirable from a management standpoint, but worrying from a warfighting one. On June 22, 1942, Churchill wrote to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. That letter, preserved in Churchill's papers, is the earliest indication of what would become his consistent private verdict on Eisenhower. Excellent at coalition management, questionable as a battlefield commander. Churchill's first encounter with George Patton came in January 1943, when Churchill traveled to Casablanca for a conference with Roosevelt on Mediterranean strategy. Patton was present at several planning sessions, as he was scheduled to command American forces in the upcoming invasion of Sicily. Churchill's initial impression was immediate and visceral. Where Eisenhower was measured and consultative, Patton was direct and emphatic. Where Eisenhower talked about what should be done, Patton talked about what will be done. Where Eisenhower acknowledged the enemy's strength, Patton dismissed the enemy's competence. Churchill was simultaneously impressed and unsettled. Impressed by Patton's obvious confidence and fighting spirit, unsettled by his apparent indifference to political consequences. During one planning session on January 16, 1943, Patton argued forcefully that American forces should be given the lead role in the Sicily invasion rather than serving in a supporting capacity to British forces under Montgomery. His argument was blunt. American soldiers are just as capable as British soldiers. American commanders are just as competent as British commanders, and American taxpayers are funding most of this war. We should not be treated as junior partners. The room went silent. British officers present were visibly offended. Eisenhower, also in the room, looked uncomfortable and moved quickly to soften Patton's remarks. But Churchill, surprisingly, was not offended. After the meeting, he spoke privately with Field Marshal Brooke. Brooke recorded the conversation in his diary that evening, noting that Churchill seemed to appreciate Patton's directness, even while acknowledging that Patton's political instincts were terrible. This was the beginning of Churchill's complicated relationship with Patton. Respect for his fighting ability, combined with deep concern about his inability to navigate the political dimension of coalition warfare. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 gave Churchill his first opportunity to observe both men under the pressures of actual combat. What he saw confirmed and sharpened his initial assessments in ways that would shape his private views for the rest of the war. The Sicily campaign opened on July 10, 1943, with successful amphibious landings along the island's southern coast. Patton commanded the American 7th Army on the western flank. Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army on the eastern flank. Eisenhower was the overall theater commander responsible for coordinating both. From the outset, the campaign exposed fundamental differences in how Eisenhower and Patton approached war. Montgomery's original plan assigned British forces the primary role. driving up the eastern coast toward Messina, while American forces protected Montgomery's western flank. This reflected Montgomery's assumption that his more experienced troops were better suited to the main effort. Patton was furious at being relegated to a supporting role. He appealed to Eisenhower for permission to mount an independent American advance along Sicily's western coast toward Palermo. Eisenhower, caught between supporting his American subordinate and maintaining cooperation with Montgomery, vacillated. He gave Patton limited permission to advance, but with restrictions that frustrated him at every turn. Churchill followed these developments through daily intelligence briefings and direct communications with Montgomery. His assessment, recorded in a letter to War Secretary James Grigg on July 18, 1943, was pointed. General Eisenhower is trying to please everyone and consequently pleases no one. Patton wants to fight. Montgomery wants to control. Eisenhower wants peace between them. This is not leadership. This is arbitration. Churchill was not accusing Eisenhower of malice or incompetence. He was identifying what he believed was a fundamental limitation in Eisenhower's command style, a tendency to prioritize consensus and harmony over decisive action. This worked well in planning and logistics. It worked considerably less well when operational opportunities demanded quick, bold decisions that would inevitably leave some commanders unhappy. Patton, refusing to be sidelined, effectively ignored his restrictions and drove his 7th Army rapidly across western Sicily, capturing Palermo on July 22nd before Montgomery's forces had even taken Catania on the east coast. He then raced Montgomery toward Messina, the strategic prize at the island's northeastern tip. American forces entered Messina on August 17, 1943, hours before British forces arrived. It was a personal triumph for Patton and a humiliation for Montgomery. Churchill's private reaction was layered. On one hand, he appreciated that Patton had delivered results. American forces had proven they could fight as effectively as British forces. Patton's aggressive drive had shortened the campaign and kept German forces off balance. But Churchill also recognized that Patton had achieved this by essentially circumventing the command structure and generating friction within the alliance. In a letter to his wife Clementine on August 20, 1943, Churchill captured his emerging theme. Eisenhower's weakness was his inability to impose his will when circumstances demanded it. Then came the slapping incidents, August 3rd and August 10th, 1943. Patton visited field hospitals in Sicily and encountered soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. In both cases, he became enraged, accused the men of cowardice, and struck them. The incidents were witnessed by medical staff and reported up the chain of command. Eisenhower learned of them but chose not to take public action. He sent Patton a sharp private reprimand and required him to apologize, but did not relieve him of command or pursue formal disciplinary proceedings. His reasoning was that Patton was too valuable a combat commander to lose over what Eisenhower characterized as errors in judgment rather than criminal offenses. The story remained private until November 1943, when journalist Drew Pearson broke it in a radio broadcast that reached millions of Americans. The public reaction was immediate and severe. Many Americans, particularly those with family members in uniform, were outraged that a general would strike enlisted soldiers suffering from psychiatric conditions. Members of Congress called for Patton to be court-martialed and dismissed from the Army. The scandal threatened to become a major political crisis for the Roosevelt administration. Churchill watched the crisis unfold with close attention because it revealed something important about both men. Patton's behavior confirmed Churchill's assessment that he lacked the political judgment necessary for high command. Striking soldiers in a modern democratic army was inexcusable, regardless of Patton's views on combat fatigue. But Eisenhower's handling of the crisis also confirmed Churchill's assessment of his limitations. Eisenhower had known about the incidents for months and had taken only minimal action. When the story became public, he defended his decision not to relieve Patton by arguing that Patton's combat value outweighed his errors in judgment. Churchill agreed with the conclusion, but not the reasoning. In a private conversation with Field Marshal Brooke recorded in Brooke's diary on November 25, 1943, Churchill made his position plain. Churchill ultimately defended Patton publicly when the matter came before Parliament. He argued that removing Patton's combat leadership would harm the Allied war effort more than retaining him would harm military discipline. But privately, Churchill had concluded that Patton could never be trusted with independent strategic command. His tactical brilliance was undeniable. His political judgment was catastrophically poor. The slapping incident confirmed that Patton belonged at Army command level or below, never at theater command or above. The Normandy campaign, from June through August 1944, gave Churchill sustained observation of both men operating under the most intense pressure of the entire war. What he witnessed during those months solidified his private assessments and deepened his frustration with certain aspects of how the campaign was being managed. D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, was primarily a validation of Eisenhower's strengths. The invasion required unprecedented coordination among naval, air, and ground forces from multiple nations. Eisenhower managed the planning effectively, made the difficult decision to proceed despite marginal weather, and maintained unity of command throughout. Churchill, who crossed the Channel shortly after D-Day to visit the beachhead, wrote to King George VI on June 16, 1944. General Eisenhower has orchestrated the invasion brilliantly. The political and logistical complexity of this operation cannot be overstated, and Eisenhower has managed it with a skill that few commanders could match. This was genuine praise. Eisenhower had done what he did best, coordinating a massive coalition operation. But as the campaign ground through June and July, Churchill grew increasingly frustrated with its pace. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery were making slow progress toward Caen, a city that was supposed to fall on D-Day but was not captured until mid-July. American forces under Bradley were fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy at significant cost in casualties and limited gain in territory. By late July, Allied forces were still largely confined to a narrow beachhead. Churchill believed the Germans were being given too much time to stabilize their defenses and bring up reinforcements. In a sharply worded telegram to Field Marshal Brooke on July 20, 1944, Churchill wrote, "We appear to have achieved tactical surprise on June 6th and then squandered the advantage through methodical operations that gave the enemy time to react. I wonder whether a more aggressive theater commander would have driven inland more rapidly in those critical first weeks." This was an implicit criticism of Eisenhower. though Churchill carefully avoided naming him directly. Then Patton arrived. He had been kept in England as part of an elaborate deception to convince the Germans that a second invasion would come at Calais. Patton took command of the newly activated Third Army on August 1st, 1944, just as Operation Cobra, Bradley's breakthrough offensive, finally shattered German defensive lines near St. Lo. What happened next was what Patton did best. Third Army poured through the breach created by First Army. Patton's forces drove west into Brittany, then wheeled east in a sweeping advance across France. Between August 1st and August 31st, Third Army advanced more than 400 miles, liberated dozens of French towns and cities, and reached the Moselle River on Germany's border. It was one of the most rapid, sustained advances by an army in the history of modern warfare. Churchill followed Third Army's progress with enormous satisfaction. This was the kind of aggressive mobile warfare he believed in. Patton was not stopping to consolidate gains or wait for supplies to catch up. He was maintaining relentless pressure on retreating German forces, giving them no opportunity to establish new defensive lines. In a letter to Clementine on August 28, 1944, Churchill wrote with obvious pleasure, "Patton is showing what can be accomplished when a commander has the instinct to pursue victory without hesitation. Third Army has advanced farther in 1 month than some of our forces advanced in 2 years in the First World War. This is the kind of generalship that wins wars quickly." But Churchill's satisfaction with Patton's performance was mixed with frustration about the broader command situation. Because while Third Army was racing across France, British forces under Montgomery were advancing far more slowly in the north. The contrast was stark and politically uncomfortable. British newspapers were praising Patton's brilliant campaign while implicitly questioning why Montgomery was not achieving similar results. Churchill understood the operational reasons for the difference. Montgomery was facing stronger German opposition. Patton was exploiting a breakthrough someone else had created. The two situations were not directly comparable. But Churchill also believed that Montgomery's cautious, methodical approach was inherently slower than Patton's aggressive style, and that this difference in command philosophy explained at least some of the difference in results. This created a political problem. Churchill needed Montgomery to succeed to maintain British prestige within the alliance. But Patton's success was making Montgomery look slow by comparison, and Churchill's private assessment was that the comparison was at least partly justified. In a conversation with his personal physician, Lord Moran, on September 2, 1944, recorded in Moran's published diaries, Churchill said, "Patton has the quality I most admire in a commander, the ability to sense when the enemy is vulnerable and to strike without waiting for perfect conditions. Montgomery does not have this quality. Montgomery waits until conditions are perfect, which means he often waits too long." This was the core of Churchill's comparative assessment taking shape. Patton had battlefield instincts that produced rapid victories. Montgomery had careful planning that minimized risk and casualties. Eisenhower had political skills that kept the coalition functioning. Each had strengths. Each had limitations. But Churchill was increasingly convinced that the command structure was not optimally arranged to exploit any of them. The period from September through December 1944 brought Churchill's frustrations to their peak. A series of strategic decisions during these months highlighted what Churchill saw as fundamental problems with Eisenhower's leadership and revealed his private belief that Patton's talents were being systematically squandered. The first crisis was fuel. In early September 1944, after Third Army's spectacular August advance, Eisenhower made a strategic allocation decision. He redirected fuel supplies northward to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to use airborne forces to capture bridges in Holland and potentially cross the Rhine months ahead of schedule. The fuel that would have kept Third Army advancing went to Montgomery instead. Patton's tanks stopped for lack of gasoline. Churchill understood the strategic logic. Market Garden, if successful, would breach Germany's last major natural defensive barrier and potentially end the war before Christmas. But he also believed the decision revealed Eisenhower's bias toward cautious, set-piece operations over aggressive exploitation. Market Garden failed catastrophically. British airborne forces at Arnhem were surrounded and destroyed. The operation that was supposed to end the war produced instead one of the worst Allied defeats of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, the fuel shortage gave German forces time to establish new defensive lines along the Moselle and in Lorraine. When Third Army finally resumed operations in mid-September, it faced far stronger resistance than it would have encountered a week earlier. Churchill's private assessment of this sequence was harsh. In a letter to Field Marshal Brooke on September 28, 1944, he wrote, "We stopped Patton to support Montgomery's gamble. Montgomery's gamble failed. We lost the opportunity Patton's momentum had created, and we sacrificed British airborne troops in a poorly conceived operation. This is what happens when a supreme commander tries to be fair rather than effective. Eisenhower chose the operation that was politically safe rather than the one that was militarily promising." This was as close as Churchill came to openly criticizing Eisenhower's strategic judgment. He believed Eisenhower had made the wrong choice, and that the decision had been shaped by political considerations. The need to give Montgomery a high-profile operation to maintain British prestige rather than purely military logic. Then came the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, the attack caught American forces off guard and carved a dangerous bulge into Allied lines. Eisenhower's response was to place all American forces north of the bulge, including Bradley's First Army, under Montgomery's temporary command. To ensure coordinated defense of the northern shoulder, militarily, the decision made sense. Montgomery was geographically better positioned to command forces on the northern flank, but politically and psychologically, the consequences were devastating. Bradley was humiliated at being placed under Montgomery's command. Patton, whose Third Army was ordered to counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration, was furious that Montgomery was being given credit for managing the overall response, and Montgomery's behavior made things considerably worse. On January 7, 1945, after the German offensive had been contained, Montgomery held a press conference in which he strongly implied that British leadership had been essential to saving the situation, and that American forces had effectively been rescued by British tactical competence. American commanders and the American press reacted with outrage. The controversy threatened to fracture the alliance at a critical moment. Churchill had to intervene personally, calling Bradley to assure him that Britain valued American contributions and privately reprimanding Montgomery for his tactless remarks. Churchill's private assessment of the entire episode, recorded across multiple letters and diary entries during January 1945, was that Eisenhower had once again prioritized political considerations over optimal military command. He believed Bradley should have remained in command of American forces on the northern shoulder, with Montgomery commanding British forces. Eisenhower's decision to place Bradley under Montgomery was intended to ensure unity of command, but it had created the very resentment that undermined the unity he was trying to achieve. More significantly, Montgomery's press conference had exposed something important about Eisenhower's authority. Montgomery had directly contradicted the narrative Eisenhower was trying to maintain. He had claimed the Battle of the Bulge as a British-led rescue of American forces, and Eisenhower's response had been to privately ask Montgomery to be more careful in future public statements, rather than to rebuke him openly. Churchill's comparison to Patton was implicit, but unmistakable. Patton had wheeled Third Army to counterattack into the Bulge with extraordinary speed, covering 100 miles in brutal winter weather and hitting the German flank exactly when it was needed. He had delivered battlefield results under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, but Patton received far less public credit than Montgomery, because Montgomery's press conference had shaped the public narrative. And Eisenhower had allowed this to happen. The final months of the European War, from March through May 1945, crystallized Churchill's assessment of both men. Two specific decisions during this period defined his private judgment and shaped his understanding of how the war's endgame was being managed. The first was the Rhine crossing. In March 1945, Montgomery had been planning Operation Plunder, his elaborate crossing of the Rhine near Wesel, for weeks. The operation was scheduled for March 23rd to 24th and involved massive preparation, overwhelming force, and extensive air support, including a major airborne drop. Montgomery had invited Churchill and other dignitaries to witness what he promised would be the decisive blow of the war. Then, on the night of March 22nd to 23rd, Patton quietly crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim with minimal preparation and light casualties. He called Eisenhower the next morning to report that Third Army was already across before Montgomery's operation had even begun. Churchill learned of Patton's crossing from Montgomery, who was furious at being upstaged. Churchill's reaction, recorded by his secretary John Colville, was telling. "Marvelous," Churchill said when he heard the news. "Absolutely marvelous. Patton has stolen Monty's thunder and proven once again that aggressive action beats meticulous preparation." But Churchill also noted more quietly, Eisenhower allowed this competition to develop. He should have either given Patton explicit orders not to attempt a crossing before Montgomery, or given Patton explicit permission and resources to cross first. Instead, Eisenhower did neither. And now we have two Allied armies competing for credit rather than cooperating toward common objectives. This captured Churchill's view of Eisenhower's command style precisely. Eisenhower avoided decisions that would make subordinates unhappy. This sometimes produced good results by accident, as when Patton's initiative yielded an unexpected success. But it also produced unnecessary friction and competition within the alliance. The second decision, far more significant, was Eisenhower's choice not to prioritize Berlin as an objective. By late March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly into Germany. Soviet forces were closing from the east. The question facing Eisenhower was whether Western Allied forces should drive toward Berlin to capture the German capital before the Soviets, or focus on destroying remaining German military forces wherever they could be found. Churchill desperately wanted Allied forces to take Berlin, not for military reasons. Berlin's capture would not meaningfully shorten the war at this stage, but for political ones. Churchill believed that whoever occupied Berlin and central Germany would control those territories in the post-war settlement. If Soviet forces captured Berlin and occupied eastern Germany, those areas would fall under Soviet political control. Churchill wanted Western forces to occupy as much German territory as possible before the war ended, to limit Soviet post-war influence. Eisenhower disagreed. His view was that Berlin was no longer militarily significant. The German government had evacuated. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts. Racing the Soviets to Berlin would cost American and British lives for no military gain. He believed the Western Allies should focus on destroying German military forces in southern and western Germany rather than pursuing politically symbolic objectives. On March 28, 1945, Eisenhower sent a telegram directly to Stalin informing him that Western Allied forces would not advance on Berlin, but would instead focus on southern Germany. He did not consult Churchill or the British chiefs of staff before sending it. Churchill was blindsided. He learned of Eisenhower's decision from Stalin's response, not from Eisenhower himself. Churchill was furious. In a series of increasingly urgent telegrams to Roosevelt and messages to British military leaders between March 29th and April 2nd, he argued that Eisenhower had made a catastrophic strategic error. He wrote to Roosevelt on March 31st, 1945, making the case as forcefully as diplomatic language permitted. His private assessment was even blunter. In conversation with Lord Moran on April 3, 1945, Churchill said, "Eisenhower has handed Stalin half of Europe. We will regret this decision for decades. Eisenhower understands logistics and coordination. He does not understand strategy or politics. A supreme commander must understand both." Churchill explicitly contrasted Eisenhower's approach with what he believed Patton would have done in the same position. He told Field Marshal Brooke that Patton would have been in Berlin before the question could even be debated, and that Patton would have been right to go. This was the most revealing statement of Churchill's comparative assessment. Eisenhower's caution and political sensitivity had produced a decision Churchill believed was strategically wrong. Patton's aggression and disregard for diplomatic niceties would have produced a decision Churchill believed was strategically correct. But Patton was not Supreme Commander precisely because his political instincts were so poor that he could never have managed the coalition effectively throughout the war. Churchill was caught in the fundamental dilemma that had existed from the beginning. The commander with the best political skills made poor strategic decisions. The commander with the best battlefield instincts lacked the political skills to be trusted with strategic authority. There was no perfect solution. But Churchill believed the Allies had chosen the less optimal compromise. In a letter to Clementine on April 10, 1945, Churchill wrote with obvious frustration, "We have organized this war brilliantly, but we are ending it badly. Eisenhower has coordinated the coalition effectively, but he has lost sight of what we are fighting for beyond the defeat of Germany. Patton understands that war is the continuation of politics by other means, but he cannot be trusted with political authority. So we stumble toward victory with neither the political vision we need nor the battlefield aggression that could compensate for its absence." What was Winston Churchill's private opinion of Patton versus Eisenhower? After nearly 3 years of close observation, countless meetings, extensive correspondence, and watching both men command under every variety of circumstance, his assessment was clear, consistent, and far more critical than anything he ever said in public. Churchill believed Eisenhower was the right choice for supreme commander given the political constraints of coalition warfare. But he also believed Eisenhower was strategically timid and excessively focused on maintaining consensus at the expense of optimal decision-making. Churchill believed Patton was perhaps the finest tactical commander America had produced in the war, with battlefield instincts and aggressive spirit that could have shortened the conflict by months if fully exploited. But he also believed Patton's political judgment was so catastrophically poor that giving him strategic authority would have fractured the alliance. Churchill's private assessment, expressed in various forms throughout 1945 and 1946, was that the ideal would have been to combine Eisenhower's political skill with Patton's battlefield aggression in a single commander. Since this was impossible, the Allies had to choose which quality to prioritize at the supreme command level. They chose political skill over battlefield aggression. This choice enabled the alliance to function, but arguably prolonged the war. Churchill never fully reconciled himself to this compromise. He understood its necessity, but remained convinced that opportunities had been lost because the command structure prioritized consensus over boldness. In his war memoirs, published between 1948 and 1953, he was diplomatically respectful toward both men, praising Eisenhower's coalition management and Patton's combat effectiveness, and never publicly revealing the doubts and frustrations he had expressed in private. But in the personal papers that only became available decades later, Churchill's real assessment stands as a testament to the impossible demands coalition warfare places on those who must lead it. Political skill and battlefield brilliance are both necessary. They rarely exist in the same person. The Allies won the war with commanders who had one or the other, but not both. And Churchill spent the rest of his life wondering whether they could have won it faster and ended it better had the command structure been arranged differently.